So, having explored the core tenets of Pyrrhonism, we naturally arrive at a fascinating question. What does it mean for a person to be a skeptic? Specifically, what kind of self can someone who constantly questions everything possibly possess? It's like trying to define self itself. Philosophers have wrestled with it for ages. The dictionary throws us a curveball with terms like permanent subject of consciousness. Sounds like something Hume would poke fun at. But let's set that aside for a moment and consider a different take. One that might resonate more with how we actually experience ourselves. Now, if we go with that first idea, the Oxford self, this permanent, unchanging essence, well, the skeptics, by their very nature, seem to be saying, nope, not buying it. They're famous for doubting everything, including the idea of a fixed self. So, on the surface, it seems like skeptics just don't have this kind of self. And maybe that's fine. Maybe we all get along without it. But here's where it gets interesting. Even though they deny the existence of this specific type of self, many people, including some sharp scholars like Miles Burnyeat, felt there was something off about the skeptic, a kind of detachment, a lack of full humanity. It's like they're living life, but from behind thick glasses, or perhaps slightly out of sync. Why this feeling, even if they reject the problematic definition? This leads us to the alternative definition, the Webster self. Think of it less as a rigid, unchanging soul, and more like a dynamic collection, a union of elements like your body, your thoughts, your feelings, your habits. It's what makes you you, gives you continuity, but it's not necessarily locked in stone. This view doesn't demand a permanent inner puppeteer, nor does it insist that only your mind defines you. It feels more grounded, less prone to the philosophical pitfalls that plagued the Oxford self-concept. So the big question becomes, can a Greek skeptic, with their skeptical outlook, still assemble such a self? Can they build a stable, recognizable identity using this Webster framework? So, what exactly are these elements in the Webster self? We're talking about a cluster of characteristics that give you your unique flavor. Think of it like a recipe for a person. You need certain ingredients, and they need to work together coherently. These ingredients aren't static. You can change your recipe over time, maybe even drastically. But there needs to be some consistency, otherwise it's just random noise. What are the key ingredients? Well, clearly, rationality is crucial. You need to think to have a self, and closely tied to that, values. You can't feel strongly about anything, have emotions, without caring about something, right? Whether it's personal taste or universal morality, values are baked into our emotional lives. So, a Webster self is essentially a rational being with a particular set of values, all working together in a somewhat stable way. Now, don't think this Webster self idea is some modern invention. Ancient Greek philosophers were grappling with similar concepts. Plato, for instance, gets weird with the idea of a constantly changing self in his Theaetetus dialogue. Socrates ill is a different person from Socrates well. He seems to find this deeply unsettling. Then there's Aristotle, who seems much more comfortable with the cluster model. His whole ethical project is about cultivating virtues, courage, temperance, wisdom, which are precisely those stable, interrelated traits that form a robust Webster self. He's aiming for the best possible version of this self. Of course, Aristotle also dips his toes into the Oxford self waters when he talks about nous, the intellect, as the real you. And Plato, with his immortal soul, clearly leans towards that essential, non-physical core. So, the debate about the nature of the self was definitely simmering in ancient Greece. Okay, back to our main character, the Greek skeptic, particularly Sextus Empiricus. His famous slogan is Adoxastos, living without beliefs. How does he pull this off? By deliberately setting up arguments or impressions that seem equally strong, leading to suspension of judgment, and ultimately achieving ataraxia, a state of peace or freedom from disturbance. But here's the million-dollar question. What exactly does Adoxastos mean? Does it mean zero beliefs? Not even the belief that my hand is currently touching the keyboard? Or is it just about ditching grand theories about the universe, while keeping all the practical beliefs needed for daily life? Sextus himself is frustratingly vague on this point. If the skeptic truly has no beliefs beyond the most basic sensory registrations, then their mental world, and thus their self, seems incredibly thin. But if they retain most of our everyday beliefs, then maybe a normal-sized self is possible after all. So, how does Sextus propose the skeptic functions in the real world? He lists 4 ways: following natural inclinations, responding to feelings like hunger, adhering to societal laws and customs, and applying learned skills like medicine. Now, the necessity of feelings part seems pretty basic. Eat when hungry, drink when thirsty. That's mostly automatic. But the other three, guidance of nature, handing down of laws, teaching of skills, these imply a lot more. They suggest the skeptic isn't just a passive blob reacting to stimuli. They use rationality, the ability to think, to weigh arguments, to follow procedures. Think about Sextus himself, a practicing physician. That requires serious rationality, and even suspension of judgment relies on rational processes, recognizing opposing arguments, understanding the concept of equal strength, implicitly relying on principles like the law of non-contradiction. Plus, they operate within a society, accepting its values like piety, even if only provisionally. So it seems the skeptic does possess the key components of a Webster self, rationality and a set of values. But wait, there's a catch. How can the skeptic use rationality and adhere to values without believing them to be true? It's like being a doctor who knows exactly how to treat pneumonia, but doesn't believe in germs or the body's immune system. You just follow the routines because they work. Sextus suggests this is how it works. You learn medicine as a set of techniques, not necessarily as a complete theory. Similarly, you behave according to social norms, like respecting elders or avoiding theft, without necessarily endorsing the underlying moral philosophy that justifies those norms. You just do it, and the same goes for rationality itself. The skeptic uses logic, follows rules of inference, but doesn't commit to the idea that these rules are objectively valid or justified. It's just how their thinking capacity is inclined to operate. It's a kind of intellectual detachment, a standoffish attitude towards the very tools and values they employ. So, what's the payoff for all this detachment? Ataraxia, freedom from disturbance. This is the skeptic's ultimate goal. Now, Sextus is careful to say this isn't some universal good that everyone should strive for. It's just what the skeptic happens to want. Interestingly, he says achieving ataraxia wasn't initially planned. The skeptics thought finding truth would lead to peace, but instead, abandoning claims about reality did. Why? Because non-skeptics are driven by beliefs about what's truly good or bad. They desperately chase the good and flee the bad, leading to constant anxiety and turmoil. The skeptic, however, having suspended judgment on these matters, simply doesn't care that intensely. They might feel pain, yes, but they don't layer on the extra suffering of thinking, "This pain is awful, I wish it weren't happening." They just feel it. As Sextus puts it, ordinary people are afflicted by their beliefs, while the skeptic is spared this higher level of affliction. So let's recap. Does the skeptic have a self? Yes, according to the Webster definition, they have rationality, they have values, they form a cluster. Okay, good, but here's the rub, it's a thin self. Most of us define ourselves by what we deeply care about, our core commitments. Our values, our passions, our principles, these are what make us who we are fundamentally. The skeptic by design lacks these deep commitments. They've deliberately stripped away the things that cause intense concern. And while this lack of commitment is presented as the secret to tranquility, it also means their self lacks depth, substance, and a strong anchor. It's like a house with no foundation, structurally sound perhaps, but lacking stability. Bern Yeats's phrase captures it well. The skeptic doesn't identify with the values involved. What does it mean to not identify with your values? Does it mean you have two selves? One is the cluster of values and rationality, and then there's another, separate self, maybe an empty vessel, just watching this cluster from afar? If that's the case, then the skeptic might not even have a unified self at all. That sounds like bringing back the problematic Oxford self we started with. So probably not the right way to interpret it. A better interpretation is that the skeptic simply doesn't treat these values as core. They don't see them as essential parts of their identity. It wouldn't bother them much if they had different values, or no values at all. It's not that they have a separate self judging the values. It's just that the values themselves aren't deeply ingrained or central to their sense of self. They're more like optional accessories than fundamental components. But hold on, could skepticism in itself be a core commitment? Like, I am committed to being skeptical. Again, Sextus is cagey. He describes skepticism as an ability, a capacity, not a belief or a value. And he uses phrases like up to now when talking about seeking ataraxia, or using the skeptical method. What does this mean? It means he's open to change. If tomorrow, seeking knowledge became more appealing than seeking peace, or if someone discovered a magic pill that guaranteed tranquility, the skeptic would just switch allegiance. No drama, no soul-searching. This suggests that even the skeptical stance itself isn't a deep commitment. It's just the current strategy. The result? A self that seems potentially dispensable, even in its current skeptical configuration. For many of us, this kind of radical openness, this lack of any firm grounding, feels profoundly disorienting. Now, here's where things get really interesting, and where Sextus's own practice seems to contradict his theory. This guy spends his entire life building elaborate arguments, meticulously constructing opposing viewpoints, and tirelessly defending the skeptical position against everyone else. Does this sound like someone who isn't committed to anything? It seems like a massive investment. So, what gives? One possibility is that Sextus, despite his rhetoric, actually does identify with skepticism more deeply than he admits. Maybe his self is thicker than the official line suggests. Or, if we stick strictly to the text, we have to accept that his actions show commitment to the goal of ataraxia, even if the method itself remains contingent. The practice demonstrates the importance of achieving the goal, even if the path taken to get there is flexible. So, if we take Sextus at his word, the verdict on the skeptic's self is, well etiolated, it's pale, thin, lacking in vigor. They have the components of a self, rationality, values, but nothing anchors them deeply. Everything is contingent, potentially dispensable. It's a self built on sand, not bedrock. And honestly, it's no surprise that many people, both ancient and modern, found this unappealing. It feels incomplete, lacking the richness and depth that most of us associate with a fulfilling human life. This perceived thinness likely contributes to the feeling that the skeptical life, while perhaps peaceful, is ultimately undesirable or even impossible for a normal human being. It's no wonder skepticism never really caught on the way Stoicism or Epicureanism did. And speaking of Pyrrho, the putative founder of this school, his approach seems to take this stripping off to an even more extreme level. There's this fascinating anecdote where Pyrrho gets scared by a dog, which apparently threw him off his usual calm demeanor. When asked about it, he supposedly said something like, "One should strive to strip off the human being." Now, getting scared by a dog isn't necessarily proof of a deep, complex self, but Pyrrho's overall persona, as described by ancient sources, is one of extreme indifference to conventional concerns. He seems to have deliberately shed the cares and worries that constitute a normal human life. Compared to Sextus, who plays by the rules of society, Pyrrho looks like a complete outsider. But both, in their own ways, seem to be moving away from the kind of robust, engaged self we typically value. Pyrrho's famous pig story really drives this home. Picture this: a ship caught in a terrifying storm. Everyone else is panicking, terrified. Pyrrho, however, remains calm, points to a pig on board and says, "Look at that pig. It's eating peacefully, completely unfazed. That, my friends, is the state of ataraxia we should all aim for." It's a stunning reversal of John Stuart Mill's famous line about preferring a dissatisfied human to a satisfied pig. For Pyrrho, the ideal isn't just tranquility. It's tranquility achieved by becoming almost subhuman in our terms, by shedding the very concerns that make us human. Stripping off the human in this context seems to mean aspiring to a state below our usual human baseline. But Pyrrho's ideal isn't just subhuman, it's also divine. His follower, Timon, praised him as god-like in his tranquility, comparing him to the sun god, whose path is perfectly regular and never disturbed. Now, Greek philosophers often pictured gods as beings utterly free from human troubles, completely detached, lacking the kinds of cares and commitments that define us. They're like perfect, unchanging machines. If they have a self at all, it's probably closer to that Oxford model, a permanent, unchanging consciousness. The ideal of homoiosis theoi, likeness to God, pops up throughout Greek thought, suggesting a similar aspiration. So, Timon's god-like praise for Pyrrho, while not explicitly calling him an Oxford self, certainly evokes a state of being that transcends the robust, messy Webster self we normally inhabit. Whether it's the calm of a pig or the serenity of a god, both images represent a move away from the full-blown human condition. So, looking at Pyrrho and Sextus side by side, it seems they converge on this point, despite their differences. Pyrrho, with his pig stories and talk of stripping off humanity, explicitly rejects the kind of engaged, committed self we usually associate with being human. Sextus, through his emphasis on detachment, the contingency of the skeptical stance, and the dispensability of the self, implicitly leads to the same conclusion. Both seem to be pointing towards a state where the core elements that give our Webster self its richness and depth are deliberately discarded. Of course, scholars love debating whether Pyrrho and Sextus were really that different philosophically. But on this specific issue, the rejection of a robust, invested self, they appear to be singing from the same hymn sheet. This brings us neatly into the next chapter, ethics. We know ancient skepticism, especially Pyrrhonism, is meant to be practical. It's not just armchair fair philosophy, it's supposed to guide how you live. And the promise is that this skeptical life leads to a better state, specifically ataraxia. But is this life actually desirable? Can someone who suspends judgment on everything still live an ethically meaningful life? Can they have values, commitments, a sense of right and wrong, even if they don't believe in any objective basis for them? This is where we'll start exploring next, beginning with the fundamental ethical question that hangs over the skeptical outlook. Is anything in itself good or bad? Before diving into ethics, let's quickly revisit how skepticism works, as Sextus describes it. It's all about creating oppositions, presenting arguments or impressions that seem equally strong. This naturally leads to suspension of judgment, not because you think suspension is the correct thing to do, but because that's just how our minds react when faced with such balanced opposition. It's presented as a passive, almost involuntary response, a feature of our natural cognitive setup. Even the act of suspending judgment itself isn't framed as an active choice based on reason. It's more like the inevitable outcome of the situation engineered by the skeptic. This emphasis on passivity and reaction is key as we look at the skeptical approach to ethics. So, how does this skeptical machinery apply to ethics? The central question Sextus tackles repeatedly is whether anything is intrinsically good or bad. Is kindness good because God says so? Is pain bad because of its nature? Or are these just human conventions? In his main work, The Outlines, Sextus concludes, unsurprisingly, that we must suspend judgment on this very issue. We can't know if anything is naturally good or bad. However, in his other major ethical work, Against the Ethicists, things get a bit murkier. While he still talks about suspending judgment regarding natural goodness or badness, the overall impression seems to be that the skeptic ends up concluding, nothing is naturally good or bad. This discrepancy has led to a lot of scholarly head-scratching. Was Sextus evolving? Did he have different versions of skepticism? It suggests the skeptical position, even in ethics, might be more complex than a simple suspension of judgment. So, wrapping up this section, we've seen that the Greek skeptic, particularly the Pyrrhonist, presents a fascinating puzzle regarding the self. Their commitment to detachment and the suspension of judgment seems to leave them with a self that's structurally present, perhaps, but lacking the depth, core commitments, and anchoring that most of us find essential to a meaningful human existence. This thinness of the self inevitably raises questions about the ethical viability and desirability of the skeptical path. It's a tension between the theoretical rigor of skepticism and the lived experience of being human, a theme that continues to challenge our understanding of this ancient philosophical stance.